Ma'am, unless you're bringing coffee, this skiff isn't for you. Captain Logan Price's words rang out with open contempt, freezing the entire room in place. Major Claire Keene remained at the terminal, her CAC card still being scanned by the system. She didn't turn around. Price stepped closer, lowering his voice as if granting her a favor, implying she had no right to be here. Two staff sergeants nearby stopped typing. The air tightened, instantly compressed under the weight of a tension no one wanted to name. Claire kept her voice steady. "I am cleared personnel, Captain." Price smirked, snatching her CAC card from her hand and holding it up to the light as if inspecting a cheap counterfeit. "Nice card. But a name and rank don't prove anything." "Who's your sponsor?" Claire answered by citing the regulation, clearly stating that the system had already verified her access. But Price refused to let go, pressing harder. "You have two choices. Tell me the name of your superior, or I call the MPs and have you escorted out." Claire didn't move, and now the eyes in the room drifted toward them one by one. Price lifted his radio, his finger hovering over the transmit button, ready to turn a fully authorized senior officer into an alleged intruder in front of the entire unit. The moment grew so suffocating that no one dared shift their weight or breathe too loudly. The humiliation stood naked in the middle of the room, yet Claire held her composure with a calmness Price could not begin to comprehend. If you believe true courage isn't found in gunfire, but in the quiet endurance of those who have walked through war, subscribe to veterans' legacy stories, and join us in preserving the memory, dignity, and honor of the silent heroes who belong to all of us. Claire said nothing. She stood perfectly still, as if the entire room had nothing to do with her eyes fixed on the terminal screen that had just confirmed her access. Her gaze didn't blink, didn't flare with anger, didn't falter. It carried a dense, steady stillness, the kind found only in those who have lived through places where the weight of gunfire and a teammate's final breaths is heavier than any insult a stranger could throw. Her hand tightened slightly around her CAC card. A small detail, but enough for anyone who understood military discipline to recognize this was the reflex of an officer trained to maintain composure even when the world around her tried to drag her into chaos. It wasn't weakness. It was control. A kind of control more valuable than any argument. In the sealed SCIF, the only sound was the low, constant hum of the server racks. The noise stretched out steady and unbroken, like the breathing of a creature watching its surroundings, waiting to strike without warning. The room, already cold, felt even colder, as everyone began to realize the tension had moved far beyond the level of a routine morning shift. Captain Logan Price looked at that silence and interpreted it in his own way. He assumed Claire was afraid, backing down, preparing to yield. In his mind, silence always belonged to the weaker, and believing that the arrogance in his eyes grew sharper. He thought he was winning that the small local authority of a young officer could overwhelm a woman he had never met. Claire inhaled a short, controlled breath, just enough for her chest to rise. No one in the room noticed, except one person, Chief Warrant Officer Grant, seated in the back corner behind a workstation. Grant did not speak, did not stand, did not intervene, but his gaze was razor-edged, cutting through Price's attitude, as if dissecting each misstep. With the experience of someone who had witnessed all kinds of soldiers over decades, he knew Claire's silence was not fear, but calculation. She was weighing something far more important than the immediate confrontation. Price still believed Claire was being backed into a corner. He didn't understand that her breath was not a sign of weakening, but the moment a seasoned soldier resets her balance after enduring an insult that would rattle a lesser mind. She wasn't swallowing her anger. She was locking it away, locking it behind discipline, behind pride, behind the hard-earned calm of someone who had survived places where mistakes cost lives. Grant watched Claire, then Price. He saw what the young often fail to see before a storm hits. There's always silence. And this silence was too perfect, too firm, too heavy to belong to someone who didn't belong in the SCIF, as Price had mocked. Grant had seen the same kind of silence on the faces of special operators moments before they made an impossible decision. The silence of those who have stood at the edge of life and death. A staff sergeant swallowed hard. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he knew bad situations in the military often start with a disrespectful remark and a silence like this. If only Price understood that sooner. Claire still didn't respond. She didn't look at Price. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes rested on the CAC card in her hand, as if reminding herself she never needed to justify anything with emotion. The system had validated her, and more importantly, so had the life she lived to earn that validation. The room felt as though someone had dropped a stone into the center of it. A few junior soldiers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. No one wanted to break that silence. Because looking at Claire, they understood that within this quiet, there was a story far bigger than a dispute between two officers. Grant exhaled softly. He knew there were moments a unit would remember for years, moments that taught people about respect, dignity, and the cost of misjudging someone. And he sensed clearly that such a moment was spreading through every corner of this SCIF. Price, still convinced he held the upper hand, prepared to speak again, unaware that this silence was the last barrier before he crossed a line he would never be able to return from. And from within this heavy, unbroken stillness, something worse was waiting, a public humiliation Price would bring upon himself by pushing far beyond what he understood. Captain Logan Price lifted Claire's key AC card high, turning it from angle to angle, as if inspecting a cheap counterfeit. He raised an eyebrow and let out a mocking line. "We've seen fake IDs before. Some of them are pretty convincing." A few soldiers in the room exchanged glances. No one dared laugh, but the way their eyes flickered was enough to show they believed Claire was in real trouble. Those fleeting looks carried just enough judgment to make the already heavy atmosphere grow even more suffocating. Price still wasn't finished. "If you're from PAO or JAG, just say so. Those sections don't need to be in the mission area." His tone was half derision, half lecturing, as if Claire had wandered into a place meant only for the real operators. Claire didn't answer. Her hand brushed the heavy object resting inside the pocket of her jacket, an irregular, scratched challenge coin, whose weight alone was enough to pull her mind back to a very distant place. One light touch was all it took for Afghanistan to return to her, as if it had never left. A flash of mountain wind, sharp enough to sting the skin. The Black Hawk rotor slicing through thin, unforgiving air. Radio calls erupting with urgent pleas, clipped commands, and the strained breathing of men running out of time. A nighttime extraction. A decision that, if delayed by half a second, meant no one in the unit would make it home. And then all of it vanished. Claire stood once more in the SCIF under cold white lights, with no one knowing that her mind had just returned from a place where the distance between life and death was no more than a single breath. Price noticed her touch the pocket and immediately bent down, yanking the object from her hand. He let out a dry, empty laugh. "Oh, a coin, cute. Did you make this at a craft fair?" The room dropped a beat. The insult was no longer implied, this was humiliation laid bare. A junior officer was belittling a field-grade officer, dismissing her achievements, her memories, even her symbols of service, as if they were worthless trinkets. No one spoke, but their eyes shifted. From doubt to surprise. From surprise to discomfort. They didn't know who Claire was, but they understood enough to know Price had crossed far beyond the basic line of military respect. Price kept going. He held the coin between two fingers as though it were evidence against her. "You bring this to prove that you belong here." Claire looked straight at him. Not angry, not shaken. Her gaze was the gaze of someone who has witnessed enough brutality to be unmoved by cheap contempt. That look made a staff sergeant nearby lower his shoulders involuntarily, as though he had just recognized something he wasn't worthy of interrupting. Price didn't understand. He mistook Claire's silence for surrender. He believed he was winning. He didn't know that this silence was carried home only by those who had lived under the shadow of death, and returned silence not of weakness, but of someone who had weathered storms he couldn't imagine. A young soldier behind them pressed a hand over his mouth, hiding his reaction. Another shook his head slightly. And Grant, from the corner of the room, never took his eyes off Claire. He recognized each small piece of truth falling into place, and he knew with absolute clarity that the first crack in this situation wouldn't come from Claire, it would come from Price himself. This humiliation was dragging him toward a line he should never cross. Claire remained standing tall, still without a word. But the eyes around the room no longer saw her as an outsider. They looked at her as someone whose calm belonged to a category far beyond the ordinary. The humiliation was no longer a clash between two people. It became the moment an entire unit watched a young officer dig a hole for himself. The more he insulted, the more he exposed his immaturity, his ignorance, and how little he understood the woman right in front of him. Claire did nothing to defend herself. She didn't need to. Her silence and the way she held her ground spoke louder than anything she could have said. And just when Price believed he had pushed Claire to the lowest point, the one person who truly understood the truth was already preparing to step in, ready to shift the entire balance of that room. Chief Warrant Officer Grant had been observing the entire situation from the corner of the room, where he sat with the familiar quiet of a man who had spent more than 30 years in uniform. He didn't step in, didn't show emotion, but his eyes, sharp and still, had seen what everyone else had missed. When Price lifted the TAC card like a prop for mockery, Grant leaned forward ever so slightly, and the moment his gaze caught the clearly printed name on the card, his silence took on a completely different weight. Keene, C.A. He repeated the name in his mind, each letter striking with a gravity that only he understood. No one else in the room had any idea what was happening beneath that surface of silence. But to Grant, that name was anything but ordinary. It carried the weight of classified reports of briefings young officers like Price would never be cleared to attend. Keene C.A. was not just a name. It was a warning. Grant rose slowly and lifted the secure phone from the workstation. He turned his back to the room, a deliberate choice to ensure no one, not even Price, could read his expression. "Sir, this is Grant. You need to come to the SCIF, now." His voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably clear, each word delivered like a report on a critical incident. On the other end of the line came silence. The kind of silence only someone with long military experience could recognize, the silence of a senior officer who understood that what he was about to hear would change everything. Grant continued, lowering his voice a fraction, but increasing its urgency. "It's Captain Price, sir. He's detaining Major Keene." "Yes. That Major Keene. Knight Heron." A heavy pause followed. Then the first sound from the distant office, the sharp scrape of a chair being pushed back, echoing like thunder from several floors above the SCIF. Grant didn't need to hear anything more. He knew the officer on the other end had already left his desk. When Grant set the phone down, nothing in the room had visibly changed. But the soldiers with good intuition felt something shift. Not the shift of an argument. Arguments happened every day, but the quiet shift that made people lower their voices, stand straighter, and look around for the first signs of something bigger. Price felt none of it. He was too busy gathering the remnants of his hollow confidence, preparing to deliver the line he believed would end the matter. "Major, I'm reporting you as unauthorized access." A few people turned to look at him, their eyes reflecting a mix of warning and disbelief. But Price kept going, mistaking Claire's silence and Grant's lack of intervention as confirmation that he still controlled the situation. Grant remained still, his hand resting lightly on the desk, his eyes fixed directly on Price. No one noticed the faint breath he released, but the heaviness in his gaze carried a message. What Price was about to face would go far beyond ordinary consequences. In Grant's mind, everything was already clear. The storm had been summoned. And when it arrived, no one would be able to shield Price from the fallout he had created for himself. Claire still said nothing. She looked down at the CAC card in her hand, as though rereading the story of her own life, how far it had carried her, and where it now placed her in this strange moment. But even without speaking, the shift in the room's eyes told her everything. They no longer saw her as someone being checked. They were beginning to see her as someone they should have been more careful to judge. A cluster of younger soldiers near the wall exchanged uneasy glances. One swallowed hard. Another looked from Grant to Price as if wanting to warn him, but lacking the authority or the courage to do so. Price still didn't understand. His arrogance blinded him to how the air around him had changed. Grant returned to his earlier stance, hands loosely folded, his eyes fixed on the doorway, the very doorway, through which in mere moments the full weight of the unit's command would enter and overturn everything. And precisely when Price believed he held absolute control, the door of authority was preparing to open, bringing with it the person who would shift the entire balance of power in the room. The SCIF door suddenly burst open, as if pushed by an invisible force. The sound of boots striking the floor, firm, deliberate, unhurried, carried a kind of authority that made everyone instinctively straighten. The room, tense just moments before, fell into absolute silence. Colonel Marcus Hale, Deputy Commander of Operations for the entire region, entered first. Behind him came Sergeant Major Whitlock and two other senior officers, the kind whose mere presence in the same room could make any meeting feel momentous. But today they were not here for a meeting. They were here because of a single call from Chief Warrant Officer Grant. Hale stopped after only a few steps. His eyes swept the room, scanning each face as if determining who was responsible for dragging him away from his desk without warning. But every movement in the room froze when his gaze landed on Captain Price, who was holding Claire's CAC card in his hand, in a posture that any seasoned officer would instantly recognize a profound act of disrespect. In that moment, no one heard whatever Price had been saying. No one heard the server racks hum behind them. Everything in the room narrowed to one point: Colonel Hale's reaction. He walked forward. He didn't look at Price. He didn't acknowledge a single person. He passed Captain Price as if he were nothing more than an inconsequential shadow. A simple act, yet enough to reduce Price from a self-asserting junior officer to a nobody in the eyes of the entire unit. Hale stopped directly in front of Claire, who had stood quietly all this time without arguing, without defending herself, steady as a rock in the middle of a storm. With a precise, decisive, reverent motion, Colonel Marcus Hale came to attention and raised his hand in salute. "Major Keene, my deepest apologies." The room felt struck by lightning. Not a single person present, not even those who had served more than a decade, had ever seen a full-bird colonel, especially a combat operations colonel, salute a field-grade officer in such a manner in front of subordinates. It wasn't ceremony. It was recognition, respect, and more than anything, it was an apology from the highest authority in the room. Claire returned the salute with a composure that silenced every last breath in the room. "No apology needed, sir." Her voice was calm and gentle, but in that moment it carried more force than any shouted command ever could. Sergeant Major Whitlock watched Claire for a long second, then glanced toward Price, a look that needed no words, but was enough to make him feel the floor rising beneath his feet. The other officers still hadn't breathed out. They had just witnessed a reversal so swift that their minds could hardly follow it. The woman publicly humiliated moments earlier had now become the recipient of the colonel's absolute respect. In a single breath, the atmosphere shifted from the heaviness of shame to a profound reverence. The younger soldiers felt as though they had just been taught something essential, that in the military, dignity is not proven by volume or authority, but by the steadfastness with which a person withstands insult and lets the truth reveal itself. Price still stood frozen, the CAC card he once treated as a fake, now turning into undeniable evidence of his misconduct. He looked around desperately for an escape, but none existed. Only the cold silence remained, a silence he had created, and a silence now swallowing him whole. Hale lowered his hand and turned. His eyes no longer held simple assessment. They were preparing for something greater. Something the room did not yet know, but Grant knew, and Claire knew, and soon everyone would know. Because immediately after that salute, the truth Captain Price had chosen to ignore would be revealed before the entire room, overturning everything he thought he understood about the woman standing in front of him. Colonel Marcus Hale turned to face Captain Price. His gaze was no longer the heavy appraisal of a superior judging a subordinate. It was a warning delivered to an officer who had crossed a line he did not even recognize. When Hale spoke, his voice was low but sharp, cutting through the silence that had settled over the room like a blade. "Captain, do you know who you just obstructed?" The question required no answer. But it fell into the room with enough force to make several young soldiers nearby grip the edges of their desks. Price opened his mouth, but he didn't have the chance to speak. Hale stepped forward, ensuring the entire unit heard what he was about to say. Major Claire Keene Hale began, his voice carrying the weight of a mission briefing. "Commander of Task Force Talon, one of the most classified special operations units in the entire theater." A few people in the room swallowed hard. That unit name was never spoken casually. Task Force Talon was the kind of force that even seasoned officers only heard about in rumors, the kind of unit mobilized when failure was not an option. Hale continued. "The lead architect of Operations Shadow Ridge and Rescue Echo." A staff sergeant near the door blinked. He had heard the stories extractions with zero casualties operations carried out in darkness, where even the smallest mistake cost lives. And she is the officer who has led multiple no-casualty missions over the past 3 years. The room seemed to shrink in one collective breath. There was no more whispering. Several soldiers stood at attention instinctively, not out of command, but out of the sudden realization of exactly who stood before them. Hale ended with a line that struck the room like a live wire. "Her call sign is Night Heron. If you knew that name, you would never have dared to lay a hand on her ID." Price's face drained of color. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked at Claire not through arrogance or suspicion, but with the stunned recognition of a soldier facing a fortress, understanding that behind her calm stood experience loss and endurance far beyond anything he had ever faced. Hale delivered the conclusion, his tone as heavy as a verdict. "You didn't obstruct a visitor, Captain. You obstructed the most important mission of the day." No one dared take a full breath after that. The truth had landed too clearly, too severely. Price lowered his head, noticing for the first time that his hands were trembling. He realized he had not only violated protocol, he had compromised his own honor as an officer. Meanwhile, Claire simply stood there, her calm demeanor serving as its own answer. No pride, no desire for revenge. She spoke only one sentence, but it struck with the precision of a moral lesson delivered to every person in the room. Standards only work when applied without bias. The sentence fell clean, sharp, and resonant, stronger than anger could ever be. Hale looked at her a moment longer than necessary, a silent gesture of respect. The young soldiers exchanged glances, then looked at Claire with entirely new eyes. No one saw her as the woman who had been insulted. They all understood she had just taught them one of the greatest lessons the military could offer. Respect is not rooted in gender, age, or appearances. It is rooted in value and action. And in that moment, no one in the SCIF dared underestimate anyone simply because they didn't recognize who that person was. And as the room reached that reverent stillness, Claire chose to speak, not to punish, but to plant a lesson meant to rebuild rather than destroy. Captain Logan Price stood frozen as if nailed to the floor. For the first time since stepping into the SCIF, he could not find a single justification, a reflexive retort, or anything at all, to hide the shame rising heavily in his chest. He lowered his head, not because a superior had shouted at him, but because he realized he had lost the most precious quality an officer must have: the clarity of mind needed to truly see another human being. Claire looked at him. Her eyes held no anger, no contempt, and no hint of mockery. It was the gaze of someone who understood that mistakes often come not from malice, but from the blind corners in how people perceive the world. She spoke softly, without raising her voice, yet every word carried a calmness that made the entire room pause to listen. "We all have something to learn, Captain." No one expected her first words to be a gentle reminder instead of condemnation. In that moment, Claire wasn't standing as a victim of humiliation. She stood like a steadfast pillar, allowing her measured response to become a lesson shared by everyone in the silent room. Price tried to speak. His lips trembled slightly. "Ma'am, I was wrong." The last three words were neither loud nor forceful, but they were sincere. They sounded like the creaking door of a dark room finally opening, letting humility spill in for the very first time. And for many soldiers, watching that moment mattered more than the confrontation itself. Because a young officer admitting fault in front of an entire unit was something rare in the military, a place where toughness often overshadows the ability to self-reflect. Claire nodded gently, not to forgive him, but to acknowledge his honesty. Then grow from it. That's the only way forward. One sentence enough to close the tension entirely. Not through punishment, but through guidance. She did not belittle Price. She gave him a chance to grow, something great officers always give to those who come after them. In the corner of the room, Chief Warrant Officer Grant watched Claire for a moment longer. He had witnessed many confrontations, many corrections, but rarely had he seen an officer transform a moment of humiliation into something constructive. His eyes, usually sharp and cold, now held a quiet respect. He said nothing, but that silent acknowledgement rippled outward to the younger soldiers nearby. A staff sergeant let out a soft breath, as if relieved of a weight he didn't realize he was carrying. A specialist standing near Price loosened the grip of his clenched hand. The entire room understood they had witnessed something more important than rank or procedure. They had witnessed dignity held firm in adversity and humility learned through failure. No one applauded. No one praised her. But the change unfolded in silence, the kind of change a military unit hopes to see: authentic growth from within a person. And in that stillness, Claire's lesson echoed like a reminder to everyone present. In the military, fairness and humility never go out of style. They are the foundation that keeps a soldier's honor intact, even when they stumble. And from that lesson spoken into the silence, what followed would not be limited to the individual. It would become a shift affecting the whole unit, the system around it, and the future of everyone who would walk into that SCIF in the years to come. "Ma'am, unless you're bringing coffee, this SCIF isn't for you." The words cut through the air, cold and laced with contempt, right beside a secure area where people usually spoke only when absolutely necessary. Claire Keene stood before the terminal, her CAC card freshly scanned, but she didn't turn around. Her silence only made the young officer behind her grow more confident in the authority he believed he held. He stepped half a pace closer, his tone dripping with condescension, as if he were accustomed to pushing down anyone he deemed not up to standard. Two soldiers nearby glanced up. No one spoke, but the atmosphere shifted abruptly, tightening around them. Claire replied with a single quiet line. "I am cleared personnel, Captain." But the man confronting her didn't stop. He snatched her card, turning it between his fingers, as though examining a cheap trinket, then mocked her, saying that a name and rank proved nothing. He demanded she identify her sponsor. And when Claire repeated the security regulations, he immediately threatened to call the military police if she didn't comply. The young officer lifted his radio finger poised over the transmit button, ready to turn an authorized senior officer into someone escorted out, like an intruder, right from the place where she had been assigned to carry out a critical mission. The room seemed to compress. Every soldier present felt the humiliation laid bare before them, and that discomfort spread across every breath. Claire remained still, so calm that no one could understand why she didn't push back. But it was the calm of someone accustomed to real pressure, not the kind delivered by careless words. In the stillness of her unwavering gaze, people sensed something far greater, something hidden beneath that silence, something Captain Price had no idea he was about to provoke. If you believe true courage isn't found in gunfire, but in the quiet endurance of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories and join us in preserving the memory, dignity, and honor of the silent heroes who belong to all of us.